Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Ukrainian Voices webinars. Thank you very much for joining us today for the presentation of the book of essays by Mykola Riabchuk, a book with a very intriguing title, At the Fence of Metternich's Garden. I'm Natalia Tronenko. I'm a co-founder and the deputy director of British-Ukrainian Aid. We are a grassroots charity registered in England and Wales. We offer help to those who suffer from physical, mental, and social disadvantage as a result of the war in Ukraine. The war which is ongoing and escalating. And as you know, right now, with the military build-up on Ukraine's border, millions of Ukrainians relive the terror of 2014 when Ukraine was invaded. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for your donations. We rely solely on our own fundraising efforts. We run a number of projects, and you can read about them on our website. All funds raised today will go towards the current project called Reintegration Through Education. And its aim is to support the Ukrainian war veterans to cover the education costs to make sure that they are encouraged and engaged actively to take part in Ukraine's political, social, and cultural life. If you would like to support this cause further, or if you would like to support any other of our projects, please donate via the Just Giving link, which you can see, you will be able to see in the chat, or via our website. I'd like to share a few housekeeping notes with you. Please write your questions in the Q&A. If you have any questions, issues, comments to make, please write to us in the Q&A. During the course of the talk, we will be publishing links to our discussants' publications in the chat. You will be able to copy them and then refer to them later. Finally, if you lose the connection, please reuse the same Zoom link and you will be able to rejoin the session without any problems. Now, today, there are very many questions. Going back to the intriguing title of the book, who is Metternich? What's so special about his garden? Why the preoccupation with the fence? What does it mean to be European or to be not European enough? What does it feel like to be sandwiched between a combat-ready Russia on the one hand and a restrained world of realpolitik on the other? We look forward to finding answers to all these questions and embarking on a journey with Mykola Riabchuk to explore Ukraine's European affair. And I'm delighted to welcome Professor Andreas Umland, who is our moderator today. Welcome, Andreas. I'll briefly introduce Andreas to you. Andreas received his DPhil from Berlin and PhD from Cambridge. He is currently a senior expert at the Ukrainian Institute for the Future in Kyiv and a research fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs in Stockholm. He is also a general editor of the Soviet and post-Soviet politics and society book series published by ibidem Press at Stuttgart. I must say that this webinar is very much inspired by Andreas, by Professor Umland, Andreas Umland, who is responsible for collecting the Ukrainian books, Ukrainian Voices book series. Andreas, thank you very much for moderating today. The floor is yours.
Yes, and before I'll give the word to Mykola, I just wanted to say that in the same way that I will just limit myself to moderating the seminar today, I'm also, with regard to the Ukrainian Voices book series, merely a moderator, or as I call myself there, a collector. So I'm not an editor of Ukrainian Voices, obviously. My role is here simply to be as a sort of communicator between Ukrainian authors and a German publisher, ibidem Press, located in Stuttgart and Hanover, which also cooperates with Columbia University Press, and the English language volumes in this series are also distributed by Columbia University Press. And my sole role there is, as I see it, is to sort of take care of the logistics of the connection between this German and American publisher, these two publishers, and the Ukrainian authors. And that means also that the series is quite pluralistic, because there's no peer review system or something. So I'm not selecting any volumes here, and the authors of the already now published or the authors who are now in print, these are so far about 15 women, Ukrainian women and men. They have different opinions on various issues. Some think that post-Soviet Ukraine's problem is that there was too much capitalism. Some think there is too little capitalism. Some think there is too much nationalism. Others think there's too little nationalism. So and I do not see myself here as in any role as limiting anything of that. The series is quite open to all sorts of authors, and I also want to take the opportunity here to call for authors to approach me, especially those who have some opportunity to translate their manuscripts into a good from Ukrainian, I guess, into a good English or German language book, and then usually I would be very happy to play this sort of mediating role towards the German publisher. And I think that is about it, what I wanted to say. I'm not going to speak here about volume 5 in this series, which is Mykola's volume, and I will just give the floor to him here, and will limit myself here to reading out the questions that we are calling you to pose in the Q&A section of this session. And I hope that by the end of the presentation, first by Mykola and then the comment by James Sherr, who is also introduced in the announcement of the webinar. After that, I will then read out or summarize the questions. And you can also pose, of course, questions to James, but primarily to Mykola, and then ask Mykola and James to answer to them. So that would be it, and the floor is yours, Mykola, please.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And actually, I have too many thanks to express to many people. First of all, of course, to British-Ukrainian Aid and to Natalia, who organized all this event. But also to my esteemed discussant, to James and to Umland. I highly respect them as scholars, even though occasionally I disagree with Andreas, and we carry out some polemics, but it's very gentle and I believe very nice polemics actually. So I believe that Andreas, he modestly defined his role as a just communicator, but I believe that he is a very right person in the very right place. And many projects, many ideas, books would have not emerged here without Andreas. He's like a catalyzer of many things in Ukraine, and I really appreciate. This book actually was strongly encouraged to be written by Andreas, and I hesitated for a few years, but finally pandemia and quarantine helped me in a way, because I was locked down in Canada, in Toronto, and had not much to do but only to engage in some past projects, to pay some debts. So I compiled this book mostly in Canada. And of course, as I was restrained also by access to the library, because it was limited. I was restrained by copyright issues, because some texts that I republished in this collection could not be achieved, could not be reached. And of course, I was restrained by my own language, because usually, typically in English, I say not what I want, but what I can. Too many restrictions, but finally this book appeared, was published very soon, and I believe in good quality, so I really appreciate. As to the book, it's collection of essays, so it's not academic stuff. It consists of 3 parts. They can be roughly defined as one part about Europe, the other about Ukraine, and the third part very personal. It's about myself. The last part was probably the most doubtful for me. I was not sure whether to include it, because these essays in the last part are very personal, and maybe they belong more to balletry, to literature than to academia. But nonetheless, I believe that I should be there in order to maybe, I don't know, to humanize all these abstract categories. So so much about the structure of the book, and a few words about its content. Why Metternich, and why all these passions about Europe? The reason is very simple, because Chancellor Metternich, who headed government in Austria for many years, he lived for, I believe, almost 100 years. He was really very senior. He became famous, or maybe notorious, by his statements that Asia begins right up behind the fence of his garden, somewhere at the end of Landstrasse, he put it. So, which means at the southeastern outskirts of Vienna. From his point of view, Vienna was a sort of borderland, yeah, because behind the fence of his garden, Asia, so-called Asia, began. Of course, Asia was very Oriental concept, something very alien and subhuman, or something very strange, very dangerous place, with troglodytes, with cyclops, and so on, centaurs. So I tried to develop this metaphor. I picked up it long ago, probably in the early 90s, when I happened to be a Fulbright in America and happened to teach a course on one course on Ukraine and the other on Eastern Europe. So it provided me with opportunity to get acquainted better with all these histories. And of course, metaphor was very suitable for my thought, because it was both about inclusion and exclusion. And at the time, of course, not at the time, we are still struggling with this problem, inclusion and exclusion. We would like to be in Europe, in so-called Europe, but we are excluded from that Europe. So I try to understand why this desire, why we would like to be there, why some people don't want to be there, and why actually we are not welcome there. So there are many different questions. My personal story with Europe is very long. Probably it comes from Soviet times, and I never had any doubt that Ukraine is European, Ukraine should belong to Europe, and so on. Of course, in Soviet times, we didn't expect that Soviet Union would end up so fast. Maximum we could expect 50 years ago, it was like a softening of the regime, probably to have something in Ukraine like in Poland. You know, Polish soft version of communism was probably the top of our dream at the time, in our lifetime, actually. It happened faster than we'd expected. We knew that Soviet Union would collapse sooner or later, but it happened sooner than we'd expected. And all these dreams, our dreams, fantastic dreams, became possible, maybe not actual, but possible. And Europe emerged as not only as a dream, but not only as an object of desire, but also as an object of some practical activity, of promotion of this idea, because of course we inherited a lot of stereotypes, inherited huge Sovietized population in Ukraine, which was staunchly anti-Western. Probably since Tsarist time, because of this Orthodox Christian stereotypes, not only communist, because of Russian nationalist stereotypes, and so on. So there was very, very huge work to persuade, to explain people that why we should be there. Since pre-Soviet times, I considered Europe, not only myself, but also my generation, because I belong to this, I wouldn't say dissident movement, but rather to countercultural movement, to young writers, artists who were maybe not openly oppositional with the regime, but quite skeptical about it. And we tried to carry out our own life, cultural life, to pursue our own writing activity, underground exhibition, concert, and so on. So we were not imprisoned for this activity because it was not overtly political, but we were harassed. I was I was expelled from the university 2 times and completed my master degree only during Perestroika in Moscow. So it was quite an adventure. But Europe for us was unquestionable authority. And it had, I believe it had 3 dimensions. One of them, of course, was, I would say, value-based, value-oriented. It was very important. It was symbol of freedom, first of all, freedom, dignity, and all these humanistic values, which was very important in totalitarian state. It also epitomized some sort of cultural center, which was also very important for Ukraine as colonial country. We felt this colonial restrictions. Ukraine didn't have a right to communicate with the outside world directly. We had to communicate only via Moscow, and it was very important to bypass Moscow, to establish direct contacts and to find some alternative cultural center, not only Moscow, but also some other cultural center in Paris, in Berlin, in New York. Ukraine was not powerful enough at the time, so we needed some symbolical center to identify with. And of course, it was a very powerful alternative, and we tried to communicate directly, at least to read some text, to get information from the West. It was not so easy because, of course, there was no direct contacts with Western countries, but at least Poland was very, very good, very important channel of such information, because the regime there was rather soft. We could get books and journals and magazines from Poland. We could read Polish because Polish language is very proximate. It's actually, at least in terms of lexics, it's closer than Russian, actually. Not everybody knows this, but it's maybe top secret. But philologists would say that it's lexically it's closer than Russian. So we mastered our Polish language, at least reading ability, and Poland played an important role in our intellectual development, and I pay some special tribute to Poland in my book. There are a couple of chapters about Poland. So, and finally, when Ukraine became independent, Europe acquired the 3rd dimension for us. It was geopolitical, which was before that, before independence, of course, it was absolutely unrealistic. But since independence, it became quite a project, and I try to think about, to discuss all these issues in my book, and gradually I noticed that my texts have some sort of resentment, which I disliked, frankly speaking. So I tried to develop some ideas and to find a balance, because what I mean, resentment was quite visible because, of course, we felt rejected. We felt that we understood that, you know, Ukraine for some reason is not perceived as a normal country, as European country, not a country at all. Exactly as Mr. Putin says, it's not even a country. And I felt it before Putin. I felt it throughout the 90s. I encountered many, because we began to travel abroad, because travel to the West, and we encountered this problem that we are not perceived as a nation, as a country at all. So of course it provoked a sort of alienation, a sort of resentment, and this resentment was very skillfully played by some anti-European forces in both Ukraine, in both Kyiv and in Moscow, who emphasize this, you know, statements that nobody expect you there, nobody need you there, forget it, you know, you have to be in our East Slavonic Brotherhood, we have to develop our Eurasian alternative community, our own alternative values, and so on. It was very dangerous speculations, which actually found some ground, and there were some arguments which supported this debate. So of course I try to avoid criticizing the West in my writing in Ukraine, but still I did it in my international articles, statements. I address this criticism to Westerners, but I try to mitigate this pathos in Ukraine in order not to overinflame some negative emotions. So it was quite a complicated game, but I pursued this frankly, I believe. And of course, I try to explain for myself why Ukraine is not perceived. Of course, there are many reasons: imperial legacy and imperial propaganda and Western stereotypes and etc., etc. What was probably the most harmful? I felt that, of course, Ukraine is different from Central East European states, from Poland, from Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, from Hungary, in many terms, but primarily because it belonged to different empire and to different cultural, religious space. But I couldn't explain this, you know, distinction between Ukraine, not only Ukraine, but also all these Western post-Soviet republics and Balkan states. Why they were treated differently? There were no difference between them, either in political culture or in economic situation, in no terms. But probably it was, I believe it was some sort of symbolic geography which plays a role, exactly like it plays a role in 1945 in Yalta when Greece was taken into Western community, while the rest Easterners were rejected. Why Greece was, you know, Western? Why Greece was different from Serbia or from Czechoslovakia? Of course, it was absolutely political decision, and something like this happened again in early 90s. Again, there was political decision to accept the Balkan states, but to reject post-Soviet states. Of course, there was consideration of Russia and so on. So, you know, there are many things which I try to explain, to discuss in my book. But also, as I mentioned, I try to counterbalance all these complaints and resentments with some positive messages. First of all, I'd like to explain my co-citizens' importance of internal transformation, of building up Europe in Ukraine, to transform our own country, to meet some requirements, to meet some standards, because nobody can do our homework instead of us. It was very important to emphasize. I had to explain some basic concepts, like, you know, like idea of social capital, of prisoner's dilemma, actually, of how difficult it is to cooperate and how important it is to cooperate. And also I tried to explain my co-citizens that we are not the only states which has a problem in the world. We have to remember that, Ukraine is one of many countries, one of 200 countries, and at least half of them have very serious problems. So, of course, European Union, the West cannot rescue everybody, cannot help everybody, especially if you don't help yourself. So it was my, so to say, double message, both to the West and to Ukraine. And I believe that this second message for Ukrainians is specifically important and visible in the last part of this book, which is actually, as I mentioned, is very personal, and it consists of very belletristic essays. It's based on my personal experience, some sort of anecdotes, and so on. So I hope in this way, these abstract ideas can be somehow grounded and become more visible, explicable, better perceived. So, well, actually, there's so much about the book. I can answer the questions. There are 20 chapters, so everybody has his own problem. Is focused on some specific problems, but basically, it's all of them are about this European dream, and what is to be done to realize this dream, to make it true, and how to communicate with the world, how to communicate with Westerners, how to communicate with Ukrainians. Both tasks are very difficult, not so easy, but we have to do it. And I believe that Ukrainians are rather successful. If you take a look at back at year 1989, 1991. Of course, it's a different country, despite all the problems, despite all the zigzags and mudding through. It's very different. Luckily, I witnessed all these events. I was lucky to live in all this time, in all these decades, and I can confirm that there are a lot of things which change. So if you hear that something is the same, it's even worse than it was, no, of course it's not. Of course it's difficult, it's problematic, it's hard, but it's absolutely different. And of course the prospects are absolutely different. We have these prospects today which didn't exist 30, 35, 40 years ago. It's absolutely clear for me, because the maximum we dreamed about 40 years ago, it was just socialism with human face. Today we can make capitalism with human face. So let's do it.
Before I give the word to James, perhaps you could simply illustrate perhaps one of the questions that you were asking and an answer that you were giving from your book, just as an illustration. The essays are sort of self-sustaining. Perhaps there's one of them that you can simply sort of retell here to those who have not yet read the book.
Well, no, it's difficult to choose, because some of them are, as I mentioned, really very critical of the Western, especially from the earlier period of my writing, from late 90s and early 2000s, like Metaphors of Betrayal, which actually about persistent betrayal of the East by the West, but also about the too high expectations of Easterners. That's also true. There's also other part. Also about this, persistent packing of Ukraine into Eurasian, so-called Eurasian space, and how this concept of Eurasia became very harmful for Ukraine, very destructive for Ukraine, because it actually muddles the water. It's absolutely destroys, complicates perception of the country. So there is a separate essay about this so-called Eurasian othering, and of course there is a number of essays about Maidan, which was very important point in our life, in my life. And I, in one of this essay, I quote very characteristic and in a way anecdotal statement from Welcome to Sarajevo film by Michael Winterbottom, where there is very symptomatic episode when the city is under the siege and there are some officials from United Nations who are coming to Sarajevo, and journalists attack them with questions and blame them for hesitation, for refusing to support people who are under siege, and they are killed daily. It's like, like in Donbass, something today. Every day somebody is wounded, killed. And officials from United Nations, they respond very patiently. They say, well, folks, we have 13 more states, nations which are in trouble, like you, or even more in trouble. So please keep patience. It's a statement which can be easily criticized, but also it has some truth. We have to remember that yes, there are all the time we can find at least 13 nations which are even in better condition, in better situation. But this is one part of the truth, one side of the truth. But the other side of the truth is that we cannot allow this official, this outspoken people to justify their inactivity, their betrayal. Actually, one thing to recognize that yes, there are other nations in trouble, and we cannot help everybody at once. But the other thing to use this argument to reject any help, to reject any engagement. So, we have remember about these two different aspects of the statement. So in each episode, in different developments, I try to find these two different sides and to present them in. This is actually the essence of essays. Essays they never are absolute. They never have a closed end. Yeah, they are open for further discussion, for further development. They invite to discussion. Essays, as I understand, essays are something. It's very open journey which provoke further discussion. So I hope it's here.
Yes, and just to maybe close this and then give over to James. Mykola has introduced here himself as an essayist, but he has a second life as a political scientist as well, and that's also how I got to know him first from reading his papers in Osteuropa. And he has also not only this essayistic volume out this year, but also a more political science book, as far as I understand. I have not yet read it, also out this year, 2021, called Eastern Europe since 1989, Between Loosened Authoritarianism and Unconsolidated Democracy, which are essays as well, but they are from lectures, and I guess they are more, I hope I'm saying this the right way, Mykola, they are more political science texts and perhaps somewhat less popular, more technical than the book that came out in Ukrainian Voices. And this book was published, as far as I understand, in Poland and by the University of Warsaw, and is sort of, so to say, a documentation of the other identity of Mykola as a political scientist.
Well,
if you want to add something to that before I give to James. Okay, then I'll give the word to James, and I would just encourage the listeners here to perhaps enter our announcement site, where you find the full biographies of both Mykola and James. James is also introduced there extensively. He's already for a long time with Chatham House, and I've just read somewhere that you are also, I hope I'm not mixing that up now, affiliated with another institute. Is that correct? Currently, yes. I hope I'm not mixing something up, but maybe you'll say that yourself. The new, the most recent affiliation that you have. We met each other, James and myself, when I was studying at Oxford in the early 90s, and James was then a fellow there, and oh no, that was actually no, we met actually in the 2000s when I was teaching there. That was later. Sorry, I'm mixing up here my two visits to Oxford, and so he has also a distinguished academic career and is, as I mentioned, affiliated with Chatham House. But maybe you could also say something about your most recent affiliation before you start your comments on Mykola's book. Please, James.
Andreas, thank you. The reason I reside in Tallinn is because I am senior fellow of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at the International Center for Defense and Security. First, I want to thank you, and I want to thank British-Ukrainian Aid for your wisdom in organizing this event. I am deeply grateful to Mykola, who is rightly revered throughout Ukraine and in many other places, for inviting me to be his discussant for this book, which I look forward to rereading in whole and in part whenever I need spiritual nourishment and my morale needs to be boosted, which it often does. If you were to state that at the start of the campaign for Novorossiya, Russia sought to eradicate from memory Ukraine's historical traditions, even Ukraine's most fervent supporters in the West today would think you were talking about the campaign that Putin launched in 2014, and that you were repeating the words of his court ideologist Vladislav Surkov, and would not grasp or suspect that these words were pronounced by Yekaterina Velikaya, Catherine the Great, at the beginning of her conquest of the same lands that she launched in 1775. It was Yekaterina who coined this expression, just as it was Nikolai I, Tsar Nicholas I, who established the first state commission to rewrite Russia's history, which meant in essence the history of all the people it had conquered. If Mykola's book achieves nothing else, this collection of essays will stand as a remorseful commentary on the West's lack of historical perspective about the factors that have made Russia an existential problem for Ukraine, at least from the founding of the Russian Empire in 1721. I would say, indeed, some decades before then. Ukraine is but the most extreme example of Russia's tradition of incorporating the history and the identity of other peoples into its own. And that is the fundamental existential threat that Russia poses. I remember early in this century sitting before an audience of young people actually on the border of de facto Moldova and Pridnestrovia, an audience of young Ukrainians and Moldovans, when a conspicuous Russian liberal, head of an institute at that time, a man who advertised himself as a liberal and a Democrat, said with great self-righteousness, "Ukraine is part of my identity as a Russian." Это суть проблемы, if you forgive me for speaking Russian. I mean, this is the heart of the problem. And Mykola provides a most eloquent, painstaking exposition of this problem. And of something worse that he discusses, which is far worse, that this Russian practice has become infectious. It is spread throughout the Western world. It has become embedded in the Western mental map. And this reflects not principally the huge resources, we know about them, that Putin invests in historical narratives, rewriting history, politicizing history, disinformation, all the rest of it. It reflects just as much the fact that until recently, most of Ukraine's history has been written by Russians. Most Westerners learned about Ukraine in Russia or through Russian sources. And worse, being an expert on Russia, even a highly critical expert on Russia, has not diminished misunderstanding of Ukraine. It's actually deepened it, because even those people incorporate a Moscow or Russian perspective. I remember an official historian in a NATO country, a government historian, dating Ukraine's incorporation into Russia from the gathering of Russian lands. No, it wasn't. The gathering of Russian lands encroached upon part of Chernihiv and didn't even touch the rest of Ukrainian territory. If an official historian in the West doesn't understand that, we have a very serious problem, and we do. And one more example, if you will allow me. I have had the privilege on a few occasions of lecturing to new experts, younger people recruited into the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office to become as people who will become Russian experts. And I've always made one point to them. You will never understand Russia if you understand only Russia. You must not only get Russia into your bloodstream, you must also get into your bloodstream and bone marrow the experience and perspective of at least one other country who Russia has profoundly influenced over the course of history. Not simply to understand their perspective, as important as that is, but to understand how Russians behave there and what they say there. You will never learn this in Moscow. I have sat in rooms in Kiev and heard Russian academicians tell educated Ukrainians who they were, who they are not, what historical paths are open to them, and what historical paths are not. And they regard this as their duty. And I remember once being in a room with Leonid Kuchma, a number of Ukrainian parliamentarians, some Western diplomats, and of course, Viktor Chernomyrdin, who was then ambassador, who stood up and lectured everybody there like an irate schoolmaster talking to recalcitrant children about what they could do and what they couldn't. And I looked at some people who we know, I won't mention their names, who were very Russophile in Ukraine, and I saw their faces turn brown with anger. This is the essence of the problem, and Mykola's book, I think, brings this across in a multitude of ways. Second point I would make, second contribution he has made, which is related, is that he has patiently and very eloquently deconstructed myth. Not just one myth, but a whole variety of myths. First, the conflation of Rus and Russia, which in Russian minds is not only a confusion, it's a state project. Totally ignoring, of course, the Mongol conquest and the fact that for 300 years it launched the lands that became Ukraine and the lands that became modern Russia on very different trajectories. And then something which I have devoted a lot of attention to, the mischievous and deeply damaging conflation between Eastern Orthodoxy and Russian Orthodoxy, whose emergence dates more than half a millennium after the Eastern Orthodoxy, with its patriarchate in Byzantium and Constantinople, established itself in Ukraine and Georgia from the 5th century, earlier. He has done all of that, and also, underscored the point. Orthodoxy in Ukraine has never been about power. Russian Orthodoxy has always been connected with the state and power. Ivan Mazepa, I don't have to tell anyone in the audience who he was devoutly Orthodox, as was Philip Orlik, who wrote the famous classic Eternal Ukrainian Constitution. By the way, Konstantin Pets, the first president of the First Estonian Republic, was also devoutly Orthodox, but he wouldn't have said he was Russian Orthodox, he would have said he was Orthodox. Mykola is just as painstaking in deconstructing modern myths. He's not the only scholar who has demonstrated that Ukraine's divisions, and of course there are many, are not ethnic. They're not even fundamentally linguistic. What he has shown, you'll see it, is that even Ukraine's regional divisions, which are very real, one should not dismiss them or minimize them, are overshadowed by differences between generations and levels of education, because underpinning all of these differences is a discord about values. Finally, just before concluding, it would be a travesty for me not to underscore my respect for the way Mykola has juxtaposed and also related vision with political reality, aspiration with realpolitik, and indeed his reluctant but stringently objective acknowledgement of the necessity for both. This is not a plea for discarding realpolitik. It's a plea for understanding the tension between these two things, to trying to reconcile it, to be aware of the trade-offs that are being made, but he accepts the necessity for making these trade-offs, which again puts this book in a very special place. And my final question, which is very dispiriting: who will read At the Fence of Metternich's Garden? Who, for that matter, has read The Formidable Histories of Ukraine by Serhiy Plokhy and Orest Sutyen? I fear that the people who read it will be those who already have taken the essentially spiritual step of believing in the importance of understanding Ukraine, for good or ill, in its own terms, and not as a reflection of Russia. And for that reason, even more sadly, those who most need to read this book in the West probably will not. Увы, на жаль. Дякуємо за увагу.
Thanks a lot, James. And I think we should start with Mykola first, giving the chance to perhaps reply. And perhaps you could also answer a short question that I have is, what is your vision, Mykola? You write about Europe, you write about your vision for Europe, for Ukraine, but what is your vision of the European Union? And, what do you think, which way should the European Union go in the future? But because that is something that eventually will also become relevant for Ukraine, because perhaps the Ukraine, when it's going to enter the European Union eventually, may enter a different organization than the European Union is now. So what is your sort of preferred, perhaps, development? What is your assessment of the development? The very presence here of James, of course, as a Brit, illustrates that the European Union, can take turns that a few years ago nobody would have predicted. So that would be something that would interest me. But perhaps first you could reply as much as you like to what James just said.
Okay, thank you. First of all, probably I'll try to answer your question, Andreas, because it's the most provocative. James placed me in a warm water, and you put more harsh question. Yeah, it's really big problem, and of course I know that many people, many influential forces try to exaggerate the problem which European Union encounters. Yes, there are serious problems both with European Union and with democracy. But maybe I'm too naive, but I believe that they would be able to overcome. Democracy would survive and European Union would survive. Maybe it has to change something. Maybe it's not a crisis of democracy, it's a crisis of institutions which can be reformed, can be improved. But so far the development of Western democracy, of Western institutions proves that they are able to survive crisis and to renew and to update and to upgrade. In long run, I believe that everything will be okay. I personally, notice another problem, which is maybe more serious, and to some extent I discuss it in the essay called Repossessions. A problem which is related to the entire world, to the globe. A problem which was not discussed in my book in detail because it's a very complicated issue. I had to analyze all the Immanuel Wallerstein writing and all these problems with world economy. But for the world, it's really a challenge. The world is in crisis, maybe in crisis, because since the 16th century or 15th, 16th century, it evolves in very pathological way, I would say, since these colonial discoveries and since this disparity between the first world and the third world emerged, it's going deeper and deeper. And this provokes many other pathologies, including the two main problems which Europe encounters: problem of illegal migration, which becomes more and more massive and more and more threatening. And the other side of the same problem is international terrorism, actually, because also there are many desperate people, many people who cannot find any other way, and this also kind of resentment with against the West. This is a challenge, and maybe I have to write another book about this, because there was no. I touched it only very briefly in Repossessions, in the essay called Repossessions. So much. But as to the European Union, I believe that it will be fixed. Institutionally, it will be okay. And again, probably by the time Ukraine enters the European Union, it will be perfect institution. I would say so. As to, so yeah, we have time. We'll wait. We have to wait. As to James' comments, they are very excellent. Basically, I can only agree and approve and praise. But one point was very important. I'm very glad that James noticed this point, that Ukraine, which is usually packed into this Huntingtonian bag of Eastern Christianity, actually is not so much Eastern Christian. It's maybe Eastern Christian, maybe even Orthodox Christian, but it's not absolutely not the same as Russian Orthodoxy. And it's very timely reminder that Ukrainian Christianity, Ukrainian Orthodoxy, not to mention Catholic part of Ukraine, but Ukrainian Orthodoxy evolved historically within the Catholic state. So it was closer to Protestantism than to Russian Orthodoxy, because it never had any state support. It was within the Catholic state. It had to fight, it had to resist, it had to learn from their opponents, to learn Latin language, to be educated, and so on. There was in Ukraine there was never tradition. There is never tradition. There was never tradition of fusion between state and the church. And this is very important. Even after incorporation of Ukrainian church into Moscow, under Moscow, still this tradition of grassroots activity remained. And I happen to read very nice study which proves that in Polish, historically Polish part of Ukraine, there is much stronger tradition of grassroots support for churches, to finance them, to collect money to develop these churches, which is absolutely untypical for southeastern Ukraine, where churches were developed by local rich people and today by oligarchs. People are not accustomed for fundraising for the churches, because there are oligarchs who would finance this, Moscow churches. And it's meaningful because this grassroots movement, these church communities, they are maybe not civil society yet, but they are embryonic forms of civil societies, elements of self-organization. So thank you very much for this comment. Ukrainian Orthodoxy is not the same as Russian Orthodoxy. And one more issue I'd like to problematize. You mentioned very critically, you mentioned referred to some person, some Russian person who told that Ukraine is part of his identity, part of Russian identity. You know, sometimes I think that it might be nothing wrong with this, because we know also a Polish example. For many Poles, Ukraine also is, historical Ukraine is also part of Polish identity, but they do not develop this idea, this feeling into contemporary resentment, into contemporary imperial projects. They just recognize that historically, yes, historically part of Ukraine belonged to Rzeczpospolita, and a substantial part of Polish history and of Polish culture evolved here on this land, on Eastern Kresy, so-called. But this is history, and it has to do with today. Well, we can respect it. It's like maybe like India for Brits, or like, no, it's not for Poles, for absolute majority of Poles, the recognition of Ukraine as part of Polish historical legacy does not evolve into some imperial ambitions, claims, and so on. And this is my difference. Probably they have been vaccinated against imperialism, against neo-imperialism. Russians were not, and this is main difference. The Poles has Jerzy Giedroyc and Kultura journal, and they had very powerful, influential Polish intelligentsia, which vaccinated Polish society against imperial resentment and all this nostalgic stuff and claims. Russia didn't have, and this is problem.
James, do you want to respond?
Very quickly.
Yeah.
You see, I think that I'm less forgiving than Mykola. I mean, I understand what he's saying, but you know, even Boris Yeltsin is completely bewildered. He kept trying to reassure the Ukrainians. We love you. We're the same as you. You're the same as us.
Great.
Ukrainians didn't want to hear that. They wanted to hear some acknowledgement of the fact that despite all the relationships and the history, there are also differences. There are real differences in political culture, in culture generally, in history, and these things have to be acknowledged and respected. And you know, even amongst Russians who are very good, deep friends, strong friends of mine, these people are very difficult to find. Very few people are able to separate things in this way. And then there are the liberalni dzierżawniki, you know, the Russian proponents of great power ideology, who have even said, you know, in the early 90s, because Ukraine is more liberal more European than we are, Ukraine has to join us, and that will help Russia enter Europe, irrespective of whether Ukraine wants to or not. But underlying all this is that Ukraine is not a center in its own right that makes its own choices by itself. They must be with us.
Okay.
Okay, anyway.
Thank you. We've now spent exactly an hour on this, and I would now perhaps go here through the questions and simply read them out, and perhaps you can, as I'm reading them out, make notes. And I think most of the questions are actually to both of you. So, for instance, Ewan Grant is asking, how do the panelists see the impact of the Ukrainian diaspora in North America, the UK, and EU? How vulnerable is Germany to the Russian diaspora? A lot of such persons around Hanover, which is also, of course, the city where the publishing house that has published Mykola's book is located. From Katja Frutiger, since the time of President Poroshenko, there have been a lot of efforts in creating a unique Ukrainian cultural identity, faith, language, and army. This also included historic studies of the pre-Muscovite time. How does this affect the Ukrainian relations to Europe? And maybe a third question from Rainer Elk Anders. If I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, please forgive me. Are there lessons from Metternich and European history that can help us prevent Russian influence and dominance in Ukraine? And perhaps I stop at this, and we have a few more questions that I'm going to read out in the next round.
Okay, should I answer all these questions one by one? As to diaspora, I believe that diaspora played important role before Ukraine's independence and maybe in the first years of independence, because they maintained, supported some tradition, publications and so on. So, and actually drew attention to Ukraine's existence, to nowhere nation. Ukraine was labeled as nowhere nation. So they reminded from time to time that it does exist. So they played important role. But today, of course, it's maybe less crucial. Ukraine does exist and can pursue its own policy, either with or without diaspora. But still, of course, it's important, especially as in Canada, in America. They are very different. In Canada, they are more numerous and more integrated into Canadian society. But Canada, of course, is much smaller player internationally than America. In America, Ukrainians are a smaller group, but rather influential, and they are able to lobby some decisions. So really, I believe it's important. It's very good that we have these people, very bright people. I know many of them. As to Russian diaspora, of course, it's very different. I cannot generalize. I believe there are, especially in Germany, I believe there are a lot of Putin verstehers. I happen to see them personally, especially in 2014, when I had some meetings and delivered speeches at Western universities and think tanks in Germany. And some of them were apparently professional provocateurs. They showed up with this St. George, symbols, and they put the same questions which were absolutely irrelevant for the topic of our discussions. I feel like, about Khmelnytsky pogroms, anti-Semitism, Petlura, and so on, even though we were discussing absolutely something else. But they knew how to distract attention and how to provoke. I believe it was coordinated. It was part of Russian diaspora in Germany. So it might be a problem. I feel it's different in America and Canada because they are more integrated and there is longer tradition of immigration. So it's more complicated issue. But still, we should not exaggerate in any case, because the main player is Russia, main player is Ukraine, and more things depends on how we play this game, what we do in Ukraine. This is my point. As to historical studies, I believe that, I wouldn't single out Mr. Poroshenko as somebody who launched these studies or who encouraged study of Ukrainian history, because actually Ukrainian politicians, of course, they needed some Ukrainian version of history, and they need actually legitimization after independence. So both Kravchuk and Kuchma, most of them paid some attention to new coverage of Ukrainian history. Maybe except for Yanukovych, he didn't care about this. He was probably too narrow-minded, and actually he gave these issues to Mr. Tabachnik, who played fatal role. I believe he largely contributed to Yanukovych's turnover. But anyway, all other presidents, they were rather maybe pragmatic, maybe opportunistic, but they understood that history does matter, and they tried to balance different visions, different opinions, as they understood it, of course. It was not, the policies were rather different under each of them, but still I cannot say that any of them pursued some extreme policies, some radical. Poroshenko is occasionally depicted as, as radical nationalist. Of course, no, he was not, and I can I can give you many proofs that he was not. He could did much more serious things, even necessary things as a president, but he didn't do. We have to understand that, you know, Ukraine since 2014 is in war with Russia, and we cannot avoid all these issues like army, language, and religion, especially army. Army, you know, nobody can deny that army is important. Maybe we may have some different opinions about language or the church, but not about army. As definitely. But I believe the situation of war imposes its own agenda, and the new president, even though he looked different, but under circumstances, he understands, I believe, that he has to pursue some pro-Ukrainian policy, whatever some people expect from him. You know, there are some, you know, raison d'etat, and he has to pursue this raison d'etat. So much about these policies. In brief, I don't think they are very different. There is big difference between policies, historical policy, or policy of memory under Kravchuk or Kuchma or Yushchenko or Poroshenko or Zelensky. There are some nuances, of course, but they are not determined by persons. But of course, persons have some influence, some impact upon these policies, but generally they are determined by general, more complicated development of Ukrainian society, Ukrainian scientific community, and of course of political situation, political circumstances, which dictate their own agenda and demands and so on. Finally, the last question was about lessons from Metternich European history that can help prevent Russian influence and dominance in Ukraine. Well, I don't think that there are any lessons, specific lessons that can prevent. The Ukrainians have to do it themselves. They can. It depends primarily on Ukrainians how to limit this influence and this dominance, and sometimes very rough political decisions are necessary, like shutdown of 3 pro-Kremlin channels, which were done recently by President Zelensky. I believe it was the right step. I don't know about this, you know, some technical issues. Maybe it should have been done differently in different legal framework. But anyway, it was necessary. A country in war cannot keep, you know, if you are involved with Nazi Germany, you cannot keep Nazi TV channels or radio stations in London or in New York. It's absolutely, for me, it's obvious. So Ukraine should do this issue, and European history, well, it's very different, and there are different lessons, so you can find whatever. So far, the only lesson for me which is important and which somehow reflected in my book is lesson of our Western neighbors, post-communist neighbors, who appeared to be rather successful in their post-communist transformation, just because they broke radically with communist past, with so-called great friendship and Eurasian Union and so on, so on. They radically change the trajectory of their development. This is, for me, this is the only lesson, the most important lesson. And the second book, which was mentioned here today by Andreas, is actually a book about Eastern Europe. It was textbook. It's based on my lectures, annual lectures, very short course for postgraduate course in Warsaw University. This is why the book was published in Warsaw. And this book is it's textbook, so it's available online. It cannot be downloaded, but it can be read online.
Yes, please, James. Please, James. Yes, sure.
Just on the history question, the correct response to this very real problem of Russia politicizing history is not that Ukraine should politicize history and adopt its own state narrative. This is very destructive and self-defeating. Ukraine should be, by contrast, a free space in which these ideas are discussed openly without stigmas, preferably in a scholarly and reasoned way, in journals like yours, Andreas, which is what you've always tried to do. I'll even say more controversially, and I always cross swords with people here, the same is true for politicizing language. The majority of the Ukrainian forces who had Russia's proxies in the East, encircled and on the point of extinction, came from Eastern Ukraine, and my understanding is the majority of them spoke Russian as their first language. That is not a weakness of Ukraine, that is a strength. That is one main reason why Putin's Novorossiya project fell apart, because he assumed if you speak Russian, you are loyal to Russia. We know that's not true. So I wish Ukrainians would recognize this as a strength. One tiny illustration, I organized a first high-level conference between senior Ukrainian generals and British generals in the armed forces, and there was a coffee break and I had to translate. And one of my British officers asked a very tactless question about when Ukraine would lose its complexes about Russia, and there was an explosion. And the general on the other side said, "You don't understand the mentality of these people over there." And I stopped everything. I said, "General, you need to understand that your Ukrainian interlocutor is saying this to you in the Russian language." So I don't want this perspective, this strength to be lost, despite the fact that obviously it's very, very important that Ukrainians are able to speak good Ukrainian proficiently and comfortably and well.
Thank you. Mykola, do you want to comment, or should I?
No, we have more questions, so maybe
Yes.
we can address some of them.
Okay. Yeah. I think I'm just going to read out now the remaining questions and then see whether additional ones come out. Mm-hmm. So a second question from Rainer Elk Anders: is Germany rather passive mediating role in regard to Russian aggression and war a continuation of Metternich and Genscherism? Then comes a question from Olex, as I read here the name, to Mykola: how do you define East European borders and Ukraine's place in the European culture? Mm-hmm. And then comes another question from Olex to James: what does appeasement of Putin tell us about current political European culture? Then comes a somewhat, I find, provocative questions from Yuri Bender, but I'm going to read it out anyway. Bearing in mind the reluctance of Western powers to recognize Ukraine demonstrated in George Bush's Chicken Kiev speech, warning against suicidal nationalism, Margaret Thatcher's insistence to hold conversations with Ukrainian leaders in Russian, and third, an abdication of responsibility to enforce the terms of the Budapest Memorandum when Russia invaded Crimea and sowed seeds of separatism in Donbass in 2014. Do you think that Ukraine should follow Metternich's metaphor of Asian encroachment into Europe and work to build closer diplomatic and trade links with China and other Eastern partners, which have so far been lacking? Well, maybe you have an idea how to answer that. And yes. Finally, from Volodymyr Oleko: taking into account the current Russian military buildup on its Ukrainian borders, what's the current role for the West in preventing a major war in Europe? And I just want to add here maybe to the question about the Budapest Memorandum, something that, of course, James and Mykola are aware of. I think that's a misunderstanding then that one often meets in Ukraine and also beyond Ukraine, that people think of the Budapest Memorandum as a sort of mini NATO, that this is an alliance. This was an alliance between Great Britain, the US and Ukraine. And unfortunately, I should say, it was not. It merely said that the obligations here for the US and Great Britain, at least if you follow the text of the memorandum, is merely not to attack Ukraine, which they did not. So they fulfilled the Budapest Memorandum. Implicitly, of course, the memorandum had a sort of a subtext that also, I mean, the subtext was obviously that this was a memorandum to protect Ukraine from Russia, which also obliged itself not to attack Ukraine, and it violated the memorandum. But there was no direct violation from the side of Britain and the US. In fact, there was already in early March 2014, immediately consultations following the Budapest Memorandum prescriptions. So at least formally, Great Britain and the US have not betrayed here Ukraine. But that is just a comment, maybe. And maybe James and Mykola want to comment on this as well. But now, Mykola, if you want to go ahead and answer, just take the questions that you find worth and interesting answering.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay, I'll try to answer all of them in one response. My response to all these questions is to track. I pursue two-track policy. So on one hand, of course, I'm ready and I'm eager to criticize the West for reluctance, for betrayal, for double standards, and so on. On the other hand, I remind my co-citizens that, well, we are responsible. We have to take care about ourselves, not to expect too much. Because God helps those who help themselves. So it's I pursue this and send two different messages to two different directions. So much about our expectations. I mentioned here this, Michael Winterbottom's film. I mentioned this comment of United Nations officials who told that, there are at least 13 countries which are more in trouble than your country. And that's true. We have to remember this, that we have to remind that we are in trouble, but remember that, we are not only in trouble. And I'm not sure that so many Ukrainians would be ready to defend, for example, Taiwan in case of China invasion there, or many Ukrainians worry about genocide of Uyghurs, where 2 million people are in labor camps in China, and who cares in Ukraine about this? So all the time I try to remind my co-citizens this this other side of the problem. But at the same time, of course, also to appeal to Westerners as please help, because it's in your interest. If you don't stop Russia today, you would have more problems tomorrow. Actually, there was a lesson of Georgia when there was no reaction, even though some experts predicted the Ukraine will be next, Crimea will be next. There were predictions. Nobody cared. In France, in Germany, they go, well, it's something not serious. It's exaggeration. Okay, you got it. So now we have to remind this. And coming back to Budapest Memorandum, of course, Ukraine did not capitalize on this asset. It was not real asset. Ukraine couldn't use it, this nuclear weapon, but it was symbolical asset. And Ukraine, of course, diplomatically it could capitalize better. But it was a young state with no international experience, no diplomatic experience, no international presence. So it was very difficult to negotiate. Of course, Ukraine could get better concession from the West. But even in this very emasculated form, Budapest Memorandum, I believe, played important role, because without Budapest Memorandum, I believe that nothing would happen. No reaction would follow. Probably after Russian invasion, probably we would face the same reaction as Georgia faced, no reaction. Budapest Memorandum, I believe, played a very important role because it forced at least to impose some very limited, but nonetheless impose action, for them to react. Without Budapest Memorandum, I wonder if there would have been any reaction from the West against Russian takeover of Crimea and aggression. This is my feeling. I cannot prove it, but I feel it. So much. I believe that I answered the most important questions, and we have not much time to address all the details. Well, maybe James would add.
Yes, James.
Yeah, I'll just pick up three that I can answer briefly. First, on the Budapest Memorandum, my own view is that it conferred on us, it was a very solemn act and very solemn political statement, and it conferred on us, particularly the United States and the UK, a moral obligation to do more than we did. But it was not a defense treaty, and if you think it was, read it. What it envisaged, if there was a problem, was appealing to the UN Security Council. We know who has a veto there. So this has been blown out of proportion. And unfortunately, what has not helped is that a treaty which in English is headed, a memorandum of assurances, is in Ukrainian presented as garanti. And this was very wicked. Form of diplomacy. It should never have happened. It created great misunderstandings. A second question, which was to me, was to explain Western appeasement. Well, you're talking about a pathology, and so you can't disentangle reasons. There's a complex of reasons. But let me mention one, and I'm not going to single out Russian money. We all know about that. There's not the same reason. There's a profound ignorance at work here, which of course reinforces with convenience and hypocrisy, because all these things get jumbled together. But the inconvenience is the minimization, the trivialization of the fundamental differences between the West and its value system and Russia as it is. And it's the tenacity of the belief system and the outlook of its state establishment. And the need constantly, we even see it now, even in the Biden administration, which by and large is behaving very well, the need somehow to reassure Russia about our intentions. You will not do it. We will not succeed in doing that. And you know what? They don't care. They know what they want. And if they feel they can get it, they will. The problem is, and it picks up another question, if we respond to Russia with mixed messages and by being subtle and all the rest of it, the Russians don't think we're sophisticated. They read this as indecision, inhibition, and weakness. And this is the most dangerous thing we could be doing at this particular point, especially in the midst of this crisis. So let me leave it at that. Thanks.
Well, I don't see any more questions. I believe I've read every question out, and if Natalie doesn't want to add anything, or then I would close it here. But Natalie, maybe you want to say something.
Well, it has been a remarkable talk, and a great amount of ground has been covered, and there is a lot to think about. And before I express gratitude on behalf of our viewers, may I remind everyone, please visit our website and donate to our projects. Please have a look at the chat and copy the links to the publications of our discussants, and follow us on social media and tag us. And of course, please follow us for the updates on our upcoming events. There will be more webinars dedicated to book presentations, books written by Ukrainians about Ukraine. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much to our discussants for this very important and very timely talk. Thank you, Mykola Riabchuk, for sharing your insights and for unraveling the mystery of Metternich's fenced garden. Thank you, James Sherr, for your thoughtful and intellectually stimulating commentary. And thank you, Andreas, for leading this discussion and for being an inspiration behind the Ukrainian Voices book series. We are also grateful to our audience for their enthusiasm and evocative questions. Thank you, everyone, and see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.